Hello and welcome to Big Picture. I am Vishal Dahiya, and today we're going to talk about the Build Back Better World concept, that is B3W. In fact, in its recently concluded summit, the G7 leadership has decided to launch a new global infrastructure initiative known as Build Back Better World, that is B3W. Now, this will help the developing economies, and the focus will be on climate, health, digital technology, and gender equality and gender equity as well. The B3W is seemingly being put in place to meet the infrastructure challenges in low and middle income countries. We'll try and understand all these focus areas of B3W. How will it work actually on the ground? And also look at the B3W from it's, vis-a-vis the Chinese BRI initiative as well. Also, we'll look at the Indian angle. What do we have to offer there in this particular initiative? And for more on this, we're joined by two distinguished experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Professor Pant. We have with us head of the Strategic Studies program at ORF, and we're also joined by former Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar. Welcome, both of you gentlemen. Let me begin with you, Professor Pant, and let's start by detailing the focus areas of B3W, and let's also understand what exactly is this new, global infrastructure initiative which the G7 leaders are embarking upon?
Well, Vishal, there's been for a long time this criticism about the inability of the West to come to terms with China's growing role around the world, and especially the way China has redefined the rules of the game when it comes to infrastructure financing and connectivity initiatives, which is via its principle Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that is something that the world has been looking for very, very seriously over the last few years. There have been multiple debates about what it stands for, how does it go about working, how China has operationalized it, how China is engaged with, in particular, lower and middle income countries. And what China did actually, for all the problems that this initiative has created, is to tap into a narrative that has been going around for a while, that look, globalization is proceeding apace. But what we are witnessing is that globalization is keeping, the way globalization was moving ahead was that it was keeping some countries outside the frame of reference of economic globalization. And the next phase of globalization therefore demanded that infrastructure and connectivity be at the heart of it. And by pouring in money, by pouring in resources, by giving it a geopolitical heft, China actually mobilized world opinion in its favor. So what we are now looking at is the challenges that have come up with the China's way of working around these initiatives, especially BRI, especially infrastructure and connectivity. And what has happened that a lot of the countries have actually been at the receiving end of it. When it started off with great promise, clearly something that China wanted, a vacuum that China wanted to fill. And China, the other countries welcomed it. And I think, but what in operational terms, what it meant was that China started using it to expand its own geopolitical influence. So rather than it becoming a process or an instrument of helping lower and middle income countries, it became an instrument of subverting their rise in some ways or for a more equitous world order. And that's where now the G7 is focused on, because individual countries from the West have been talking about it, have their own initiatives. Even in the Indo-Pacific, we have our own initiatives in terms of dealing with this problem. But I think now with world's 7 most advanced industrial countries asking this question as to what they can do by filling up this gap and providing an alternative to lower and middle income countries when it comes to quality financing of infrastructure, transparent financing of infrastructure, some of the ways in which they can distinguish their efforts compared to what China is doing. And I think that is what this initiative will be about if it comes to be operationalized. And I think this is why it is to be welcomed especially for lower and middle income countries.
Okay. Ambassador Sajjanhar, as Professor Pant is pointing out, would you agree that quite a timely and apt move by the G7 leadership there to counter Chinese influence, specifically, in the developing economies out there?
Well, it could have come a little earlier also, Vishal, if, one would be candid, because let's see as to when the Belt and Road Initiative started. It started in 2013. And that was the time when, the West had undergone sort of a downturn. We had the financial and economic crisis in 2008, 2009. Then we had the Eurozone crisis in 2010. So the economies in the West were not doing too well at that time. So all the exports from China to the other countries, they had come down, they had declined a great deal. China had huge capacity, domestic capacity, and it was also not being used to build infrastructure domestically. So it had all these possibilities and it started going out. So 2013, President Xi Jinping, who had just then come to office, he announced the Belt and Road Initiative. And the first Belt and Road Forum was organized in 2017. Now, there were lots of problems as far as this is concerned. Some of them have been detailed by Professor Pant, but some of the most egregious of the issues, the problems, the difficulties were that it was leading the funding of infrastructure, which was in terms of creating railway lines, ports, roads, power plants, etc. in developing countries. There, what was happening is that these developing countries were getting into a debt trap. Also, there was no transparency. The terms and conditions of these contracts were not known. There was huge overmarking. That means a lot of corruption as far as these projects were concerned. Okay. There was no creation of jobs in the host countries where infrastructure was being created. There was no transfer of technology. All these, the machinery and the people who would create this infrastructure would come from China. There was no economic viability. Even as far as these countries are concerned, they did not know as to what benefit or advantage it would accrue to them. But it was basically for Chinese benefit. Okay. And most importantly, all these projects were basically being used to expand China's influence, China's dominance in the world, and to meet its own hegemonic ambitions and aspirations. So it was not a geo-economic project as China would have everyone believe that it was to create a community of common destiny and prosperity. But basically, it was to enhance China's outreach, China's global influence, and to give stand up against, challenge the dominance of the United States. Okay. So these were the problems, and developed countries and several others, even India. India did not join it. You'll come to that, I'm sure, later in the program. Mm-hmm. But many countries who found problems with the BRI, they kept on saying we have to get an alternative. And today we have got a positive alternative, which is transparent, which will have economic viability and sustainability at its heart, and it will keep in view, it will not lead to debt trap, it will have financial prudence at its, as one of the cornerstones. So I think if it succeeds, if it is able to get off, I think it will be an extremely good pushback as far as China's ambitions to dominate the world are concerned.
Okay, fair enough. A positive alternative to BRI has finally emerged, as Mr. Sajjanhar and Professor Pant, both of you are pointing out there. And as you said, Mr. Sajjanhar, this could have come a little earlier as well, but better late than never, if that is something which we can add here. Coming back to you, Professor Pant, the finances are being pledged. Let's look at the tangible outcomes and the way those tangible outcomes can be achieved. The focus areas, as per the statement from G7 summit, says that it'll be climate, health, digital technologies, gender equality and equity, and it'll strengthen education and skilling and then facilitate labor market participation, capture diversity, region, gender, age, sexuality, all these as well in the developing economies, middle and low income countries out there. But the question is, how will it happen and how should it happen?
Vishal, at times, perhaps it might be useful for the West itself to take one step at a time. I think at the moment, the agenda is pretty widespread. And I think there is much to be said about it, because clearly West also wants to make a case that, look, West is focused on a set of values which China is not focused on. So I think this is also a values-driven initiative. That look, we want to distinguish our approach from the Chinese approach, which is top-down, which is centralized, which does not take care into account the local demographics, local equity issues. It does not take into account the issues of financial and environmental sustainability. But we are all, our approach is going to be different, and we are going to make sure that those things are considered and those things are applied when the projects are pursued. So I think in some ways, it's logical that the West would make this argument. But I think, if we enter into this domain now where China is already a leader, and as Ambassador Sajjanhar was rightly saying, we are already late in the game. The West is already late in the game. The question, therefore, is can the West now pull itself up together and bring the finances to bear on this with a certain degree of clarity? That we can all talk of all kinds of values and all kinds of interesting stuff, which is perhaps important. But in the short term, what these countries need is real financing of infrastructure and connectivity projects. Now, as you say, we know clearly climate is an issue, digital connectivity is an issue. We know that apart from physical connectivity, we are looking at how emerging technologies are going to transform societies, and therefore capacity building is an issue.
And in today's world, health infrastructure is also an issue.
Health infrastructure is an issue. So clearly, the multiple issues are on the table. But are we prioritizing them? And I think that is going to be a question that is going to be asked again and again of this project. That look, it's all very well to declare grandiose ideas, but at the end of the day, what China is presenting is a very clear model. Right or wrong, they are presenting something which they say take it or leave it, and here is the money, and go ahead and we will deliver. Okay. If the West, in its process of challenging some of those normative values that China is propagating, becomes too embroiled in a range of issues, then I think the danger is also that they might not deliver at the end of it. And countries, lower and middle income countries, developing countries will become frustrated, and they will say, well, Chinese we are better off with the Chinese. At least we know where we stand and we will get the money and they will deliver. So I think there is a challenge there in terms of prioritizing. But I would agree that on all of these issues, these are all issues that matter to global governance today, and that will matter to global governance in the coming years, especially if you're looking at the fault lines also. Emerging technologies in particular is an issue on which emerging fault lines are being drawn among major powers. So clearly that has to be taken on board. But in terms of short to medium term, as they say, in the long term we are all dead. But in the short to medium term, where actually this competition is shaping up, I think much of the proof of the pudding would be in the eating. I think much would depend on how the Western nations, how the G7 is able to operationalize this faster against the backdrop of Chinese onslaught.
Okay. Indeed, specific targets to be achieved out there will have to be identified. And as Professor Pant is saying, they will have to put in place a prioritized plan of action there. And Mr. Sajjanhar, your view there, sir, on the implementation strategy, and as both of you agree that these countries, specifically the G7 bloc, also have to make up for the lost time. As Professor Pant was pointing out, China already has an edge there vis-a-vis the BRI initiative.
No, absolutely. You're right, Vishal. China has an edge. As I said, they started in 2013, and after that, they've been working. Vishal, there are some reports which seem to suggest that China, under the BRI, has projects going on in about 100 countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia. And there are about 2,600 projects worth about $3.4 trillion that are under implementation, or some of them have already been implemented. So, China has stolen a march over the developing world and the developed world, or democratic world, let me put it this way, because, I think all the values that have sought to be put forward while building infrastructure under the B3W, they are basically values of democracy in terms of openness, in terms of transparency, in terms of financial viability, economic sustainability, etc., which are not included in the BRI project. So this having been said, what has been mentioned is that the requirement is to the tune of about $40 trillion by 2035. And what the developed world and the democratic world, and I continue to say democratic world because when Prime Minister Modi was speaking about it, he said that India has huge experience in terms of our development cooperation partnership, what we have done in our neighborhood, and I think it is we have an excellent track record behind us.
Indeed.
Whether it is in Bhutan, Nepal, Afghanistan, you look at the dams, you look at the parliament buildings, you look at the highways. So I think they are absolutely of world-class quality. And this is what the Prime Minister also mentioned, that the democratic countries will have to demonstrate, basically put their money where the mouth is, whatever they are saying, deliver on it. And this scheme that has come out, I think all of us have really heard it for the first time getting out of G7. Mm-hmm. And this seems to be purely an American idea because, when this B3W, the statement even came out, it was not on the G7 letterhead. It was actually on the White House letterhead. And that is what it mentioned, that the idea is that the private business will be encouraged to put in billions of dollars into these initiatives. And the rest of the details, they will be worked out by the G7 countries. But I think, of course, it will have to, the G7 will have to expand itself to include many other countries. And I'm sure India, with its experience, we have in any case, been working along with Japan to execute projects, infrastructure projects of similar nature, whether it is in Sri Lanka, whether it is in Bangladesh. The Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which we started with Japan, that also is basically to reach out to the African countries and to see what their needs are, what their demands are, and how India and Japan can together look at it and, in similar terms of transparency, of being very open about it and responding to the needs of these countries, we can work towards it. So I think this is a first step. As they say, first step is always the most difficult step. It is the first step, but it's a very major step. And of course, we should not take our eyes off the ball, but take it forward in unity with G7, and G7 has to expand and bring other countries also which have experience as far as this area is concerned.
Okay. Now, since you spoke about Mr. Sajjanhar, India's experience as far as with the infrastructure projects, not only nationally but internationally as well. That brings me to the other aspect, and let's start with Professor Pant here. Professor Pant, from Indian perspective, if we have to look at this initiative B3W and the way our response has been to BRI, the kind of experience India as a nation has, and the way it is sort of has the kind of relations with the G7 grouping. What do you think India's role there will be in the B3W initiative, and what is in it for us?
Vishal, I would think that India will play and should play a very, very important role, because partly, it all goes back to India itself. The critique that India presented of BRI from the very beginning, actually, that's where the genesis lies of what is happening today around the world when it comes to pushback against BRI. At that time, we were alone, and we were told by some of our best friends around the world that don't do this. You'll be isolated. Don't challenge China on BRI. So now, of course, rest of the world and large parts of the world, especially in the developed world, are speaking the language that India used in its first, rebuttal to China's BRI, and it was, some people misconstrued it as saying that, oh, this is simply about CPEC. It was never about CPEC only. India's response was, of course, driven by what was happening in China and in the disputed territories. But I think it was also driven by the larger normative consensus that India thought that this is the projects, the BRI, the very basic logic of BRI is something that is going to be detrimental to the developing countries. And India has been proven right. in that context. If you look at the reality today, the debt trap diplomacy, the dangers that the smaller countries are facing because of BRI's profligacy. So I think at the end of it, India's normative push on this issue now become a larger consensus around the world. And that is what is driving many of these countries now, whether it is bilaterally, trilaterally, and now at the level of G7, to push for an agenda on connectivity, on infrastructure that is derivative of those arguments that India presented at the very beginning into 2013 onwards. So I think India continues to play a very important role, and in its own way, we have seen India working with other countries, like-minded countries, whether, as Ambassador Sajjanhar was referring to, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, whether it is working with Australia in the South Pacific, whether it is working even with European countries and saying that, look, if you look at the India-EU summit, the connectivity initiative that came out of the India-EU summit, it's primarily driven by the sense that India and the West are united in managing or in challenging China on some of the most fundamental issues of our times. So I think what G7 is doing today is rising up to the occasion, perhaps a bit late, but nonetheless, finally, the most important advanced industrial nations of the world as a unit have realized the enormity of the challenge they face. They've realized how they have to come up with a cohesive, united agenda. And under American leadership, as we know that this was largely an American-driven issue on the G7 agenda, we will, and given the sharp fault lines developing between America and China, I think we are going to see a greater push towards alternatives being offered by the West. And this perhaps is going to be the most important one if it can be operationalized quickly. And India will, I would think, should have no hesitation in working with this format with countries, with our partners in the West, because we are already working bilaterally and trilaterally and other formations with a lot of the countries. We also can talk about Quad. I think it also was part of the Quad discussion. Indeed. When the connectivity infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. So I think India has always been part of such initiatives, and now that it is being done at the G7 level, I'm sure India will both provide its experience as well as its leadership in managing this issue in certain geographies where India is very welcome, where India is considered a very reliable development partner, and where India can add value to the efforts of the G7 countries.
Okay. Ambassador Sajjanhar, do you agree out there with what Professor Pant is saying, that ultimately, this launch of the B3W initiative by the G7 grouping is a sort of a vindication of India's long-standing critique of the BRI initiative of China?
No, absolutely. I fully agree with that. Because, if you even trace the historical development, evolution of the BRI, as Professor Pant has very rightly said, in 2017 May, when the first Belt and Road Forum was organized, at that time, not only many countries, the Chinese tried to pressurize, coax India, saying that you'd be isolated. More than 100 countries are coming, they are participating, so you come. India was the only country that did not go and participate in the Belt and Road Forum, Vishal. There was, some junior level official from the United States which participated. Japan also participated at some level or the other. There were a large number of, Prime Minister, heads of state, heads of government who came, but a number of countries participated. But India, on a principled basis, we did not go, and we, of course, did say that respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country is absolutely essential. Indeed. And that is the problem we had with CPEC. But in addition, over and above that, we had the problems with all this non-transparency, debt trap, the financing provisions, economic lack of economic viability, environmental non-sustainability. So there were all these issues which we brought up. Okay. And when the second Belt and Road Forum took place in 2019, then a large number of countries came up with the same complaints exactly as India had mentioned. So China was forced to take cognizance and say, okay, we are going to make changes, we are going to make amends as far as implementation of the BRI is concerned. And since that time, India has been talking, and all these countries, we have been talking how, because BRI is not only a geo-economic proposition, it is much beyond that. And if China has to be countered, if China has to be constrained, there has to be an alternative. So I very warmly welcome this initiative. But again, it is, like the success of the Quad and success of this initiative is absolutely essential. Otherwise, it is going to, China will continue its march forward. So I think the G7 countries and the other partner countries which are there, I think they realize the significance, the importance of this initiative that has been taken. I think this is one of the most important initiatives coming out of the G7 discussions, and this will need all the focus and attention of all countries concerned.
Okay,
Vishal.
indeed, it is quite an important initiative being taken by the G7 grouping out there. Thank you so much, Mr. Sajjanhar and Professor Harshvi Pant as well for sharing your views and insights. There it is, as our experts clearly explained, the importance and the significance of B3W, that is Build Back Better World initiative being launched by the G7 grouping, and why it is important as well, and obviously from India's perspective, the significance and the role India has to play there. We'll come back again with a different topic. Till then, keep watching. Thank you.